Hello again everybody, and the next in my series of little lectures is about Julius Caesar, focusing on one specific thing to do with him. He's a remarkable figure in lots of ways, one of the most famous from the ancient world, but the question I want to think about today is, why was he killed? So he was stabbed by many people, including those whom he thought of as his closest friends, including, most famously, Brutus, of whom he's supposed to have said, "Et tu, Brute," and you as well, Brutus. Whether that's actually true or not, we can never know, but it would certainly fit in with the theme of my talk today. He was pretty much straight away hailed as a martyr, a man who died for the people, and his body was cremated publicly in the Forum, which was of dubious legality, massively politically controversial, but nonetheless the site of his cremation became later the foundations for the temple to the divine Julius Caesar, because not long after he died he was declared to have become a god. He was deified. You can still visit the site of his temple in the Forum today, or at least you could if the Forum was open. He was idolised by the people, the ordinary people of Rome especially, even though he came from a very much aristocratic background. He butchered many provincials, including people in Britain, but there were an awful lot of people in Gaul who died because Caesar had been there. He was famously egotistical. There'd been a period of civil war which had stretched back at least as far as the Gracchi brothers. See earlier lectures on Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus. There'd been class conflict for the best part of 100 years between groups of people who are not really political parties or movements exactly, but people who are loosely described as the populares, those of the people, and the optimates, those who considered themselves the optimi, the best people. Loosely speaking, this is lower and upper classes, or it's not quite that simple. It had been a period of great men of history, with big figures like the Gracchi brothers, Marius and Sulla, then Pompey, Caesar and Crassus, carving up the Roman state between them in what was called the First Triumvirate. Each of these great men had developed private armies under dubious circumstances of dubious legality, and they'd used those more or less private armies in order to launch political bids for power, and not just to carve up the power between them, but also to make themselves sole rulers. There had been a lot of economic changes in the previous decades. There had been political violence and murder. The Gracchi brothers, Sulla, people like Clodius, murders on the streets, and some judicial murders too. First came the Triumvirate, and then when Crassus died, or when Crassus was killed in Parthia, then it came to a conflict between Pompey and Caesar. But on the third part of that was the people of the Senate, and loosely speaking the Senate and Cicero were the third of that three. The Senate and Cicero were always mistrustful of Caesar, and they were pretty mistrustful of Pompey too, but they didn't have the power, they didn't have the backing of these massive armies. So the Senate were looking for a long time to get their own power back, the power that they had not wanted to cede to the Gracchi brothers, not wanted to cede to the displaced rural poor. So the Senate were very much felt threatened by Caesar and Pompey and others. But despite all that, what was it that on that day, why was it that day, what was it that pushed people over the edge? There had been a soothsayer's warning. And he'd said, don't go out because things are going to turn out bad today. And Caesar, even though he was ill and could perfectly well have used that as an excuse for staying at home, nonetheless went out into the Senate. He went to the Senate late, very late, perhaps to show just that he could. There was tension in the streets. There's a build-up of at least the last 5 years since he'd marched illegally into Italy at the head of his troops over the river Rubicon. and there'd been massive spending of the state treasury, building lots of big buildings in Rome, which had made Caesar very popular with the people who worked on them and made money out of them. Not quite so popular with the Senate, who thought that the money should be kept in the coffers of the state. So what pushed people? Maybe it was the imagery of him being offered the crown. Romans were famously antagonistic to monarchies. Maybe it was that finally the Senate got its act together after years of infighting. They hated each other almost as much as they hated threats like Caesar and Pompey and Crassus. Maybe it was just Caesar's arrogant disregard for others. Now, I have a reading today which is not from a classical source, but it's the next best thing. It's from Robert Harris's novel Dictator, and this describes Caesar's entry into the Senate just before he died. And this kind of makes the point that I'm trying to make. So this is being described by Cicero's secretary, Tiro. I saw through the open door that a crowd was streaming out into the portico. In the middle of the throng, like battle standards, I could see the fasces of Caesar's 24 lictors, and swaying above their heads the golden canopy of the dictator's litter. I was surprised there was no military bodyguard. Only later did I learn that Caesar had recently dismissed all those hundreds of soldiers he used to travel around with, saying, "It is better to die once by treachery than live always in fear of it." I've often wondered if his conversation with Cicero 3 months earlier had anything to do with this piece of bravado. At any rate, the litter was carried across the open space, set down outside the Senate. When his lictors helped him out of it, the crowd was able to get very close to him. They thrust petitions into his hands, which he passed immediately to an aide. He was dressed in the special purple toga, embroidered with gold, that he alone was permitted by the Senate to wear. He certainly looked like a king. All he was missing was the crown. And yet I could see at once that he was uneasy. He had a habit, like a bird of prey, of cocking his head this way and that, and looking about him as if searching for some slight stirring in the undergrowth. At the sight of the open door to the chamber, he seemed to draw back. But after a short pause, he then carried on into the chamber. He was assailed, pulled back by Julius Caesar first of all, and then everybody else piled in. So why was Caesar killed? I think really it was his arrogance that brought him down. He thought himself invulnerable. He'd been able to do so much for so long to so many people that he didn't believe that anybody would do him in. Message to leaders everywhere, anytime. It could be you. There'd been treachery from those he thought his friends. But really, at the end, maybe he should just have listened to the soothsayer.